Hello, and welcome to the Brain Bin. My head's full of rubbish, and it's got to go somewhere. Today, we're talking about semicolons. So, you've heard of the semicolon. This contentious punctuation mark has been scaring schoolchildren and causing arguments among readers, writers, and grammarians since its conception. It is many people's favourite punctuation mark, and yet many others actively avoid it, either because they hate it or are scared to misuse it. Even linguists are intimidated by it. In Why Are Semicolons Hard to Use by Answer in Progress, Tom Scott, an actual linguist, rates his own confidence in using semicolons at only 50%. In order to confuse even the professionals, the rules for semicolons must be pretty convoluted, right? Well, to get into this video, you will need to understand how semicolons work, and I'm going to teach you how to use them. Hey, don't click away. I promise, it's easier than you think. You've got this. Ready? There are two uses for semicolons. To demonstrate their primary use, we need two sentences. Let's use this quote from, according to the internet, Abraham Lincoln. I have great respect for the semicolon. It's a useful little chap. These sentences are both about the same thing. They're both appraisals of semicolons, so merging them into a single sentence would help to signify their relationship to the reader. So, how can we use a semicolon to join these two sentences together? Drum roll, please. Replace the period with a semicolon. Yep, that's it. If you want to merge two sentences together, you can put a semicolon between them, making a compound sentence. And if you want to check that you've used a semicolon correctly, just make sure the stuff on either side of it could be its own sentence. The only other rule is that semicolons can't be immediately followed by coordinating conjunctions, aka coordinators. Any of these words here. The secondary use of semicolons is in lists. When we list items such as food, countries, cities, animals, or things like that, we separate each item on the list with a comma. But if the items on the list contain commas, such as in this list of capital cities and their countries of origin, the list starts to look confusing. Is Malawi the capital of Lomé? Or is Lilongwe the capital of Malawi? To make this list easier to read, you can separate its items with semicolons. Now it goes city, comma, country, semicolon. Congratulations, you now know how to use a semicolon. Pretty simple, right? Well, semicolons used to be a lot more complicated than they are now. Earlier in their history, semicolons didn't have well-defined rules and were used in many more contexts. They were also used all the time for many purposes, although no one agreed on how to use them. Nowadays, they're used far less often and have only two well-defined functions, joining sentences and delineating lists. But even though they have never been simpler than they are today, they keep tripping us up. Semicolon errors are amazingly common if you keep an eye out for them. I lost count of how many I saw in researching for this video, and many of us completely avoid using them just so we don't have to deal with them. And if you think about it, it's strange that we find them difficult to deal with. We don't feel like we have to deal with periods, but semicolons are just like periods. No, really, semicolons go in the exact same places periods do, between independent clauses. The only difference is that they don't end sentences. Semicolons aren't complex, so there must be some other reason we find them confusing. Why could this be? To explore this question, let's discuss the application of semicolons and see if we can find out more about them that way. Semicolons are useful in a few important ways. Like we saw before, clauses with similar scopes work a bit better if joined together. They're still understandable separately, but putting them in the same sentence makes the relationship between them clearer. Merging sentences can also improve writing style. Writing that is broken into many short sentences can feel choppy and awkward, but a few well-placed semicolons can make it flow more evenly. However, semicolons aren't the only way to merge sentences together. Any semicolon can be replaced by a comma followed by a coordinator. Remember these words? Coordinators can't come after semicolons, but they can come after commas. Comma coordinator pairs are much more common than semicolons, and we seem to find them less confusing. In addition, a coordinator can give the reader a bit more information. For example, the word but highlights a contrast between clauses, and the word so establishes a cause-effect relationship. Is there any reason to use semicolons when commas and coordinators can do the trick? Here's where Lincoln's semicolon demonstrates its usefulness. Let's try taking his quote and replacing the semicolon in it with a comma and a coordinator. I have great respect for the semicolon, and it's a useful little chap. That just sort of sounds wrong. Let's try another one. I have great respect for the semicolon, or it's a useful little chap. No, that one means the wrong thing. Try them yourself if you're so inclined. The word for nearly works, but changes the meaning of the sentence slightly. Using for implies that Lincoln's respect for the semicolon is conditional on its usefulness, but maybe Lincoln loves semicolons unconditionally, and their handiness is just a bonus. In some sentences like this one, no coordinator sounds right, and in these cases, semicolons can come to the rescue. So, semicolons are needed to merge sentences together without using a coordinator. You can use either a semicolon or a comma paired with a coordinator. You can't just use a comma by itself. That's a frequently made error known as a comma splice, and it's considered one of the most egregious grammatical mistakes a writer can make. The threat of committing a comma splice is what makes semicolons vital. The most straightforward way to correct a comma splice is to use a semicolon instead, which eliminates the error while leaving the rest of the sentence unaltered. If we could use commas to merge sentences, we wouldn't need semicolons. So, why can't we use commas to merge sentences? Yeah, there isn't really an obvious answer to this. Commas can be used to join any other pair of clauses together, so why not two independent clauses? When I ask Google, it mostly responds by begging the question, telling me that using a comma to join independent clauses is improper or incorrect, without explaining why. According to the Indiana University of Pennsylvania, a comma is not strong enough to provide the strong separation between two independent clauses, but this just raises more questions. What does it mean for a comma to be strong, and why aren't commas strong? The IUP fails to elaborate. Fundamentally, the reason you can't use commas to merge sentences is just because we say so, which is, by the way, the only reason any punctuation rule exists. So why do we insist on this rule? The reason we make punctuation rules in the first place is to make writing easier to read and interpret. Have you ever read a post on social media that has no punctuation at all? Probably not, because passing a long, uninterrupted string of text is tedious and difficult. Most people will take one look and scroll right past. Adding punctuation divides the writing into manageable chunks, as well as giving us clues about syntax, making reading and comprehension dramatically easier. For punctuation to be useful, it needs to help us read and understand writing. Does a rule against comma splices do this? In most cases, no, it doesn't. Most sentences with semicolons are just as easy to read if you replace the semicolon with a comma. Yes, if you're a grammar pedant, the sight of a comma splice may leave you frothing at the mouth, but it doesn't make the sentence harder to read or understand. Other kinds of errors are opportunities for misinterpretation or confusion, but comma splices rarely create these opportunities. So, unless you're specifically looking for splices, they usually fly under the radar. Indeed, the very existence of semicolons seems to create more confusion than it resolves, given how often people misuse them. Regardless, I must concede that in larger, more complex sentences, comma splicing can generate some confusion. Take this sentence about semicolons that I ripped from a TED Ed video. At first, they may seem frightening, then they become enlightening. Finally, you'll find yourself falling for these delightful punctuation marks. If you replace the semicolons here with commas, the sentence now has 5 commas in it, and the repetitive marks can be tricky to pass. But with semicolons, the structure is far easier to see. Are semicolons irreplaceable after all? Well, let's think about it for a moment. Why does this sentence have all these extra commas in the first place? The reason is that this sentence contains 3 adverbials. An adverbial is a word or phrase that can be attached to a sentence to modify it, adding context, coherence, or clarification. Adverbials are often placed before independent clauses, and when they are, they need to be connected by a comma. The 3 adverbials in this sentence are at first, then, and finally. You can see that this sentence is made up of 3 clauses, each with one adverbial attached, that have been melded into one sentence with semicolons. These 3 sentences are similar in scope, just like in our Lincoln quote, so merging them into one might seem sensible, but they don't have to be merged for the relationship between them to be clear. If you leave them in separate sentences, the connection between them is still obvious. That's because these clauses aren't cohered together by semicolons, but by their adverbials. At first, tells you that this clause is the first of a series, and that there is more to come. Then, tells you that this clause is a continuation of that series, and finally, neatly wraps the series up. The adverbial phrases explicitly describe the relationship between these clauses, completely overpowering the weak hint provided by a semicolon. If we try removing the adverbial phrases and leaving just the semicolons, we get this. They may seem frightening, they become enlightening. You will find yourself falling for these delightful punctuation marks. Yeah, not nearly so clear. This shows that the semicolons here don't serve a purpose. Merging these sentences into one doesn't inform the reader of anything that isn't already literally spelled out. The clauses can remain separate, yet coherent. No semicolons needed. This doesn't just apply to this sentence either. Adverbials are often spelling out coherence relationships. For example, take the word however. Since however is an adverb, we have to follow a particular pattern when it appears between the clauses of a compound sentence. It goes first clause, semicolon, however, comma, and finally the second clause. This confusing string is such a common cause of errors that many style guides, such as the Chicago Manual of Style, have special sections dedicated to using adverbs and semicolons together. But once again, the semicolon here is made redundant by the adverb. The word however already describes a relationship between two clauses, telling the reader to contrast whatever follows the word with whatever precedes it. If the first word I said in this video was however, you would think that you'd missed something and somehow started in the middle, because that's what the word however means. This goes for many other common adverbials. And don't worry, I haven't forgotten about lists. Yes, semicolons have a function here, but we already have better alternatives. A dot point list is the clearest option, but can take up a lot of space and doesn't work with some formats. If you can't use a dot point list, you should use parentheses instead. Parentheses are far more visually distinct from commas than semicolons are, so they allow the reader to distinguish between a country and a city at a glance. There are even 3 different kinds of parentheses if you really need them. Both dot point lists and parentheses in lists are in common use, making semicolons already redundant here. This covers all use cases of semicolons. We don't need them at all, unless we continue to insist that comma splices are errors. But it's not just that semicolons are redundant and confusing, they come with a lot of other baggage too. Firstly, semicolons are often seen as distracting and distasteful. They are used so rarely that even 2 or 3 of them in quick succession can draw the reader's attention away from what's written to the writing itself. Even when used correctly, they can feel out of place in contemporary English. They're similar to words like whom or farewell. Sure, people will still understand what you mean when you use them, but you may seem old-fashioned, pretentious, or elitist. Inexperienced writers are often accused of overusing them, and according to many, it is good writing etiquette to avoid using them if you can. By the way, no other punctuation mark has this kind of connotation tied to it. Of course, you will be criticized for using any punctuation mark incorrectly, and perhaps for using so many commas that it makes your writing difficult to read, but only semicolons can draw criticism for being used normally. Anyway, if inexperienced writers sprinkle semicolons all over the page, great writers must use them more judicially. And they do. Many well-renowned writers, such as Kurt Vonnegut, George Orwell, and Cormac McCarthy, have expressed a distaste for semicolons, and Paul Robinson, a professor from Stanford, claims that using semicolons leaves him feeling morally compromised. Strong words. But think about it. Semicolons aren't just a stylistic choice, but are punctuation tools, necessary for a particular sentence structure. Failing to use a semicolon in certain sentences is a mistake. So, to avoid using semicolons, a writer can't just dodge a certain key on their keyboard, but must steer clear of the type of sentence that makes semicolons necessary. Remember, Lincoln wouldn't be able to write this quote properly without a semicolon. A writer who doesn't use semicolons is making their writing less flexible just to avoid a particular punctuation mark. Such a writer handicaps themselves by considering a tool of punctuation as a stylistic choice, like a handyman who refuses to use a flathead screwdriver because the Phillips head looks cooler. Actually, there is one other way to avoid using semicolons which we've already mentioned. incorrectly using a comma instead, which, funnily enough, is what many writers do. Yes, many writers deliberately make mistakes just so they don't have to use a semicolon. A famous example of mass splicing is in the very first sentence of A Tale of Two Cities by Charles Dickens. It was the best of times, it was the worst of times. It was the age of wisdom, it was the age of foolishness. It was the epoch of belief, it was... you get it. This quote has been charged with a total of 13 counts of comma splicery. You might think this massacre is taking a dislike of semicolons too far, but it genuinely makes sense. Despite beginning with a pile of so-called errors, A Tale of Two Cities is considered one of the greatest pieces of literature of all time. But if written, quote, correctly, unquote, it doesn't seem so great. The semicolons stand out, acting like speed bumps for readers, but it's easy to glide over the commas, and when the splice goes unnoticed, no interpretation error follows. This isn't just about fancy prose either. Short, mundane sentences that you might use in everyday settings look especially weird with semicolons in them. Semicolons in these sentences distract readers while offering no aid in comprehension. If you want to write down-to-earth dialogue, splicing is the way to go. And for situations outside of professional writing, avoiding semicolons is generally the smart move too. Do you want to telegraph your pedantry while trying to seem fun and casual in an Instagram post? Why ruin the vibe of a friendly DM with a semicolon, unless it's part of a cheeky wink? Would you like to risk coming across as condescending or snobbish in that email you sent to your landlord or boss? No, you're better off just pretending semicolons don't exist, which is exactly what most of us do. It's not like anyone will misunderstand you, and what kind of person would interrupt the conversation to point out the error? Someone you don't want to talk to in the first place, that's who. I believe that our neglect of semicolons is also partly due to the fact that they don't have an apparent intuitive purpose. Commas add more to a sentence, and periods end sentences. Colons introduce explanations or examples, like this. But semicolons, well, they, add more sentence, like a comma, but the extra sentence is more, sentency? Sometimes? To a casual reader, they just seem like weird commas. So, we just stick to the normal commas. We don't even try to use semicolons because we don't see the point of them. We don't know how to use semicolons because we don't know why to use them. Even young children will start trying to use commas and periods without being told to, because even to them, it's obvious that they're useful, but we only start using semicolons when we are told how to and that we have to. The seeming pointlessness of semicolons and our resulting uncomprehension of them leads to an enormous number of errors. No matter how often they are explained, misplaced semicolons and comma splices remain rampant. But imagine we changed the rules and said that commas can now be used to join independent clauses, and that we no longer need to use semicolons at all. Immediately, two of the most common grammatical mistakes would completely evaporate, significantly reducing the total number of errors made. Everyone would feel more comfortable writing, grammar pedants would have less to whine about, and little of value would be lost. Sure, maybe we should put more effort into understanding punctuation, but punctuation ought to be intuitive too. It shouldn't give us a puzzle to solve, but automatically help us clarify our writing. Its usage and purpose should be so self-evident that we barely have to think about it, but this obviously isn't the case for semicolons. The purpose of punctuation is to make writing easier to read, write, and comprehend. So if the semicolon is causing more confusion than clarity, well, it's fundamentally failing to serve its purpose as a punctuation mark. Semicolons are still necessary in modern English, but for only one reason. Comma splices are regarded as errors, despite causing no loss of clarity. Adverbials cohere between sentences better than a semicolon can, and commas, periods, and parentheses can work together to replace semicolons and substantially reduce the number of mistakes we make. Semicolons are already disliked by many, who go out of their way not to use them, changing the structure of their sentences, or even deliberately making mistakes just so that semicolons don't appear on their page. And in the hands of those who don't know how to use them, they generate countless errors while elucidating nothing. Semicolons are a relic of the past. It's time to let them go.